Hello, my friends. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we begin, in a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. There's a strange comfort in knowing someone else is awake in the dark. I'm right here beside you. Miles back, my dash cam caught a flickering neon sign for an old roadside motel. Every time the red light buzzed vacancy, the shadows on the shoulder moved closer. I can feel those restless spirits right now, filling the back seat, giving me goosebumps as they whisper their histories. But you are safe here. As I am hearing this rain while driving, no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing, so you can relax of the night. Our high-speed world keeps us too alert, but tonight, we escape it. If these videos help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed, or just wrote something small in the comments. Even a single word. It helps other tired people find their way here too. Now, let us begin. I have been a man who reads things for 30 years. Documents, handwriting, the pressure a pen leaves in paper long after the ink has dried. I have built a career on the understanding that everything a person touches carries a record of them, whether they intended to or not. I believe this completely. I still believe it. What I did not understand until 3 weeks ago is that the reverse is also true. That some things, when you touch them, leave a record in you. That some objects carry their own intention. And that a man who has spent 30 years learning to read what others have left behind is exactly the wrong person to find what I found in that tin box. Because he will not stop until he understands it. And understanding it will cost him everything he did not know he had. I should say at the outset that I am not a superstitious man. I make this point not defensively, but as information relevant to everything that follows. Because the entire sequence of events I am about to describe depends on understanding what kind of person encounters what I found and what that kind of person does with it. I am a forensic document examiner. I have been one for 30 years. I authenticate questioned documents, disputed wills, suspected forgeries, anonymous correspondence in criminal proceedings, historical manuscripts, whose provenance is uncertain. I read handwriting the way other people read faces. The pressure, the slant, the breaks between letters that reveal whether a signature was written by the hand it claims to belong to. I find the hidden true thing beneath the presented false one. That is my entire professional life, and I am very good at it. And I do not say this with pride, so much as with the simple accuracy of a man who has taken 30 years to become precise about what he is. My name is Owen Marsh. I am 53 years old. I live in a colonial on a wide, quiet street 20 minutes south of Providence, in a neighborhood where the houses are maintained and the yards are wide and a man can go a full week without speaking to anyone he has not specifically decided to speak to. My wife Margaret and I have lived there for 19 years. She is a landscape architect. She tends things carefully and with great patience, and she is, in the specific way of people who have spent a long time loving someone who is not quite present. Very tired. I bought the tin box on a Saturday in late October at an estate sale in Barrington. I want to be exact about this because exactness is the discipline I was trained in, and it is the only tool I have left that still feels reliable. The sale was in a Victorian on the water, the kind of house that goes up every generation in this part of Rhode Island and holds a family for 60 or 70 years, and then releases its contents into folding tables in the yard when the last of them is gone. I was not looking for anything in particular. I attend these sales occasionally, the way some men fish, not expecting anything, but unwilling to rule it out. The tin was on a table near the back, behind a collection of pewter candlesticks and a cardboard box of Reader's Digest condensed novels from the 1980s. It was approximately 4 inches in diameter, flat, the kind of container that might once have held throat lozenges or sewing notions, with a friction lid that had seized with age. The surface was plain except for a faint embossed pattern along the rim that I could not immediately identify. There was no label, no price sticker. It had been overlooked, which is, in my experience, the most reliable indicator that something is worth attention. I paid $3 for it and carried it home in my coat pocket. Margaret was in the garden when I got back, moving the last of the tender plants inside before the frost. She looked up when she heard the car and raised one hand, a gesture that was both greeting and something else I had trained myself not to read too precisely. I raised mine in return. I went inside. I went upstairs to my study, where I keep the equipment I use for preliminary examination: a stereo microscope, a set of archival lamps, the basic chemical supplies I use for quick initial analysis before sending anything to the lab. I set the tin on my examination mat and looked at it for a while under good light before I touched it again. The surface told me it was old, not antique old, not 18th century old, but old enough. The oxidation pattern on the lid was consistent with something manufactured in the early part of the last century and stored in variable humidity conditions. The embossed pattern I had not been able to identify in the low light of the estate sale resolved under the examination lamp into a simple repeating wave motif that I associated with decorative objects from the 1920s and 30s. The lid had seized because the tin had been slightly bent at some point, a corner impact, likely accidental, and the deformation had pinched the rim just enough to make normal friction inadequate to open it. I did not force it. I do not force things. I applied a small amount of penetrating oil along the seam and let it sit for 20 minutes while I made tea. Margaret was in the kitchen when I came down. She was washing the soil from her hands at the sink, her back to me, and she said without turning around, "Find anything good?" I told her about the tin. I described the embossed pattern, the oxidation, the probable date range. She listened in the way she listens to me, with what I have always taken for interest, and have recently begun to understand might be something more patient than interest, something more like waiting. "That sounds interesting," she said. She dried her hands. She did not ask to see it. I went back upstairs. The lid released after the second application of oil smoothly and without damage, and when I removed it, I found what I expected to find inside an old sealed container that had not been opened in a very long time. The compressed residue of decades, a film of particulate matter, and at the center of it, nestled in what might once have been a small piece of cloth now reduced to a kind of fiber memory of itself, a braid of human hair approximately 7 inches long, and perhaps as thick as my index finger. I put on examination gloves and lifted it out. I have handled a great many unusual objects in 30 years of forensic work. Hair, when it appears in questioned document cases, is not uncommon, found between the pages of diaries enclosed in letters, threaded through the binding of journals. I know what old hair looks like, how it behaves, how to date it by its structure and composition. I know it as material, as evidence, as the physical residue of a person who is no longer present. I turned the braid under the lamp and examined it with the stereoscope. Multiple sources. That was the first thing I registered professionally. This was not the hair of one person. The braid had been constructed from strands of varying color and texture, woven together with a deliberateness that was, even to my analytical eye, striking. I could identify at minimum 5 distinct hair types: dark brown, nearly black, a warm chestnut, a deep auburn red, something the color of pale wheat, and running through the center of the braid, from one end to the other, a single continuous strand of white, not gray, white, the complete absence of pigment that comes at the end of a long life or, in rare cases, as the result of sustained and profound shock. I noted this. I noted all of it. I pinned the braid to a clean piece of white archival card and set it under the lamp to dry while I documented my initial observations. What I felt in that first hour was purely professional satisfaction. The clean pleasure of an anomalous object that would reward careful examination. I have felt this many times over 30 years. I recognized it completely. It felt exactly like itself and nothing else, and I had no reason to think it was anything other than what it appeared to be. I stayed in my study until past midnight. Margaret left a light on in the hallway, the way she does, and turned it off sometime around 11 without coming to the door. I heard the sound of her moving through the house below me, the particular sound of a person navigating a shared space alone, which is a sound I had long since stopped hearing, and have only recently begun to understand I was always capable of hearing, had I ever chosen to listen. I did not go down, I made notes, I made very precise and thorough notes, and on the white archival card under the examination lamp, the braid lay with its colors sorted by the weaving into a pattern that was almost symmetrical, and the white strand ran through the center of it, like something that had always been there, waiting to be found. I did not touch it again that night. I covered it with a clean sheet of archival glassine and turned off the lamp and went to bed. The next morning I found, on a photograph of my colleague Richard Howe, that I had pinned above my desk 3 weeks earlier, pinned there because it was attached to a document chain I was working, a small mark, directly where the archival pin entered the paper, a slightly curved purple mark, the size of a pinhead. I sat down very slowly in my chair and looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at the glassine-covered braid on my examination mat. Then I looked at the photograph again. I am a man trained to find pattern, and the pattern I was looking at was impossible, which meant either my observation was in error or my understanding of what was possible needed to be revised. I did not reach for the phone. I did not call Richard Howe to ask how he was feeling. What I did was reach very carefully for a fresh pair of examination gloves, and I began to think about methodology. I want to tell you about the methodology I developed. Not because the methodology matters in itself. It does not, or it does not matter in the way I told myself it mattered, which is the distinction I have been working toward for 3 weeks, and have only recently gotten close enough to see clearly. I want to tell you about it because the methodology is the clearest illustration I have of the specific way a trained mind can be used against itself. The way a person who has spent 30 years learning to find hidden truth can use that same training to construct a structure of inquiry so thorough and so procedurally correct that it functions from the inside as a way of not asking the one question that actually matters. I am a forensic document examiner. I find the real thing beneath the false one. I authenticate. I verify. I establish whether what appears to be true is actually true, and whether what appears to be false has been made to look that way deliberately. I do this through methodology, through the systematic application of specific tests in a specific order, each designed to rule out the explanations that do not fit until what remains is the explanation that does. This is rigorous work. It is honest work. I have been proud of it for 30 years. What I did with the braid in the weeks after I found it in the tin box was rigorous and procedurally correct, and about as honest as a man can be when he is using his expertise to circle the thing he has decided not to face. The first test was controlled and limited. A second photograph, not Richard Howe, whose marked photograph I had already replaced with an unmarked copy and returned to the document chain where it belonged, with a note in my file that I had needed to reprint due to damage. The second photograph was of a man named Gerald Tupper, who was opposing counsel in a civil fraud case I had been consulting on for 6 months, and whom I actively disliked for reasons that were specific and professional and entirely genuine. Gerald Tupper was a man who had spent the preceding 6 months dismissing my findings with the particular condescension of a lawyer who believes that expertise is something you perform rather than something you develop over decades. I found Gerald Tupper's photograph in a legal directory and printed it on standard paper, and I pinned it to my examination board with an archival pin above the left shoulder, away from the face, and I laid the braid on the examination mat beside it, and I waited. I am not proud of this. I want to be clear that I am not telling you this as a neutral procedural account. I chose Gerald Tupper deliberately because choosing a person I disliked was a way of framing what I was doing as a controlled test rather than as a choice. And the framing was dishonest in a way I understood at the time and filed under methodology so I would not have to look at it directly. 26 hours later, Tupper appeared in the legal directory with a mark above his left shoulder. I documented this. I photographed the directory page. I cross-referenced the placement of the mark with the placement of the pin in the photograph. I compiled a detailed record of the test conditions, the elapsed time, the materials used. I ran the test again with a third subject, a name chosen at random from the Providence Journal's public records section, a person I had no connection to and no feeling about either way. A mark appeared. I documented it. I checked the timing. The results were consistent. I sat at my examination desk in the third-floor office on Benefit Street with the documentation in front of me, and I looked at it for a long time, What I was doing, I told myself, was establishing the parameters of a phenomenon. I was not making judgments about the phenomenon. I was not drawing conclusions about its implications or its applications or its ethical dimensions. I was doing what a forensic examiner does, which is establishing what is real through repeatable and documented testing. The phenomenon was real. I had established that. What I did with the knowledge of its reality was a separate question that I would address separately after the documentation was complete. I have reviewed this reasoning many times in the past 3 weeks. It is very clean reasoning. It has the internal structure of genuine scientific rigor. And it is the most dishonest thing I have ever written in 30 years of professional practice. Because what it leaves out is the part that Gerald Tupper's photograph represents, which is that I had already made a choice about what I intended to do with the knowledge before I finished the testing, and the testing was a way of constructing justification around that choice, rather than a way of approaching the question with genuine openness. I knew I was going to use it. I knew this from the moment I replaced the photograph of Richard Howe with an unmarked copy and filed a note about printing damage. I knew it from the moment I went looking for Gerald Tupper in the legal directory rather than going to my wife. Margaret had been asking me something for many years, not in words, or not only in words, in the specific, patient language of a person who has decided to keep loving someone who is not quite present and has made peace with the terms of that love without ever stopping to want something different. She asked me at dinner, and in the evenings when I worked too late, and on Sundays when she gardened, and I was in my study, and the space between those two rooms was the same space that had always been between us, and that I had always been too busy, or too focused, or too convinced of the sufficiency of what I was giving to notice. I noticed it now. I noticed it because I had something in my study that could, in principle, close that space, and I was not using it for that. The not using it was information about myself that I had not previously had access to. I did not go to Margaret. I went to Gerald Tupper's photograph. What followed over the next 6 weeks was the period I am least able to account for clearly, not because the events are unclear, but because the person I was during that period is someone I can describe, but not fully inhabit in memory. The way you can describe a dream with accuracy, but cannot reconstruct the feeling of being inside it. I used the braid. I used it with the methodology I had established, the controlled conditions and the documented results and the careful record keeping. That meant what I was doing had the architecture of rigorous inquiry, even when it had ceased to be anything of the kind. Gerald Tupper lost the fraud case. I do not know with certainty that this is connected to what I did with his photograph, and I have not tried to establish it because establishing it is not something I want documented anywhere. I know what I did, and I know when I did it, and I know the timing of the outcome, and I have chosen to leave those 3 things in the same file without drawing the line between them, which is perhaps the most dishonest thing I have done in this entire account, and I am aware of that. There were others, not many, 4 in the 6 weeks. People I disliked for reasons I was able to construct as legitimate. A neighbor whose renovation noise had disrupted my work for the better part of a year. a former colleague who had published findings that drew from work I had shared in confidence, a man who had been rude to Margaret at a neighborhood association meeting in a way that I had not addressed at the time and had not stopped thinking about since. 4 people, 4 photographs, 4 pins placed with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had constructed enough procedural architecture around it that he could, at the end of each session, file the documentation and go downstairs and have dinner with his wife and feel, if not entirely at peace, at least on the right side of what was happening. Margaret asked me in October, the 6th week, if I was sleeping. I said yes. Why? She said, "You look like someone who is working on something difficult." I said, "A complex case. Authentication dispute. It should be finished soon." She looked at me for a moment, with the specific quality of attention she brings to things she has decided not to press on, and she nodded. And she passed me the salt, and we talked about something else. Her landscape architecture practice, a project she was excited about. The way she described it, her hands moving, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who has found work they love and knows it. I listened to her. I was present enough to hear what she was saying, and to ask a question at the right moment, and to see her face when the question told her I had been paying attention, which produced in her a brief, surprised warmth that I recognized immediately as something I had not produced in a long time, and that I did not deserve to produce now, given what I had been doing in the room above the kitchen for the past 6 weeks. But I received it. I held it. I sat across the dinner table from my wife and received the warmth that her surprise at being heard produced in her, and I knew I had not earned it, and I held it anyway, and that, if I am being fully honest, is when everything began to go wrong, not because of the warmth. Because of what the warmth told me about what I had not been giving, and what I had sitting in my study, that could in principle give it more reliably than I had managed in 30 years of marriage, and the fact that I had not used it for that and was not going to use it for that, and what that meant about why I had really picked up the braid in the first place, and what I had really been examining all along. The 5th photograph was a man who had wronged me professionally 20 years ago, a case that had ended badly because of his testimony, a case I had thought about intermittently for 2 decades. In the way you think about a loss you were not able to prevent and could not rationalize away. I found his current photograph in a conference directory. I printed it. I brought it to my desk. I held the pen over the photograph for a long time. The white strand in the braid was visible from where I was sitting. The single continuous thread of complete white running through the center of the braid, from one end to the other. I had noticed it on the first examination, and I had cataloged it and assigned it an explanation: age, the hair of someone very old, or someone who had experienced profound shock, and I had not thought about it specifically since. I looked at it now, the white strand lying along the center of the weave, the one consistent element running through every color around it. I set the pin down. I want to tell you what I thought about in that moment, because it is not what you would expect. And because it is the moment everything I had been doing became impossible to continue doing while also being the person I had believed I was. I thought about the tin box, not the braid inside it. The box itself, the estate sale in Barrington, where I had paid $3 for it without knowing what it contained. The table at the back of the Victorian, behind the pewter candlesticks and the Reader's Digest novels, where it had been sitting unnoticed. I thought about who had put it there, which is to say, who had packed the contents of that house for sale, which is to say, who had gone through the rooms of a dead person's life and decided what to keep and what to release. And I thought about the braid, multiple sources, multiple people, living or dead, whose hair had been woven together into a single object and sealed in a tin box and put somewhere it would not be found easily, or would be found only by someone who was specifically looking for it, or would be found by the wrong person and cause harm, or would be found by no one and cause none. Sealed. The tin had been sealed, not locked. It had no lock. Just sealed, the friction lid pressed shut, the slight deformation from an old impact making it difficult enough to open that the penetrating oil required was itself a small barrier. Something had been put inside that box, and the box had been closed with an intention I could not determine from the evidence available to me. I had spent 30 years finding hidden things. I had never asked, with sufficient seriousness, why they had been hidden. Margaret went to bed at 10:30. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the bedroom door, and the particular settling of the house that happened when she was in it, and still. I sat at my desk with the pinned photograph in front of me, and the braid on its archival card, and the 5-photograph documentation of everything I had done in the past 6 weeks, and I held all of it in my attention, at the same time the way I hold a disputed document, trying to see the whole thing at once, the surface and the structure, and the intention behind the construction. What I saw was not what I had been telling myself I was doing. What I saw was a man who had found something that gave him power over the distance between himself and other people, and who had used it entirely in one direction, outward, against, who had not once, not in 6 weeks of careful, documented, methodologically rigorous use, pointed it at the distance that actually mattered, the distance across the dinner table, the distance between his study and the garden where his wife spent her Sundays with her hands in the soil while he worked in the room above. The distance that had been there for 30 years, and that he had spent 30 years too focused and too capable and too professionally engaged to notice, honestly, or to do anything about. I had found something. I had used it to mark people I disliked. I had not once thought about using it to reach across the only distance that had ever cost me anything real. And now I was sitting at my desk with a pen in my hand and a photograph of a man who had wronged me 20 years ago, and I knew, with the specific clarity that comes at the end of a methodology that has finally run out of ways to circle the truth, that the question was not what I was about to do to this man. The question was what I had already done. The question was what kind of person spends 6 weeks with something extraordinary and uses it to settle scores. The question was Margaret, asleep in the room at the end of the hall. 31 years of a marriage that she had sustained with more patience and more continuity than I had ever brought to my end of it, and what I had found, and what I had done with it, and what I had not done with it, and what that meant about me. I set the pin down. I did not pin the photograph. I sat at my desk for a long time in the quiet of the house at night, the street outside going occasional and distant through the old glass of the windows. And I looked at the white strand and the braid, and I thought about sealed boxes and the things that get put inside them, and I thought about why. I destroyed the documentation on a Thursday morning in November, while Margaret was at a client meeting in Cranston. Not the photographs themselves. Those I could not destroy without destroying documents that were part of legitimate case files and that had other professional purposes. But the supplemental file I had been keeping, the one that existed entirely outside of any professional context, the one that was a record of what I had done with the braid, across 6 weeks of careful methodology, that I shredded and put in the recycling bin and stood over for a moment before I went back. Inside, I want to be accurate about what this accomplished. It did not undo anything. Gerald Tupper still lost his case, or lost it partly, or lost it in timing that I had affected, and I cannot determine to what degree, and have stopped trying. My neighbor's renovation was still ongoing, and the mark I had placed on his photograph was still somewhere in the world in the specific way that marks on photographs appear to persist, which I know from the testing, and which I have not tested further because testing it further would require me to continue engaging with the braid, and I have not continued engaging with the braid. The documentation I destroyed was a record of what I had done, not an undo mechanism, and I knew this when I destroyed it. I destroyed it anyway because it was the one action available to me that was not continuation. I put the braid back in the tin box, not immediately. It sat on my examination mat for another week, covered with the archival glassine sheet I had placed over it on the first night, undisturbed. I worked around it. I came to my desk in the mornings and opened my case files and did my work and did not touch it. The way you do not touch something when you have decided about it, but have not yet figured out what the decision requires. What the decision required, I eventually understood, was returning it to the condition in which I had found it, sealed, hidden, put somewhere that was not my study, not my life, not accessible to a man who had demonstrated, across 6 weeks of meticulous documentation, that he could not be trusted with what it offered. I sealed the tin. I drove to Barrington on a Saturday morning in November, the kind of New England November day that is gray without being dark, the harbor visible from the highway with its surface, the same flat gray as the sky. The old houses along the waterfront settled into themselves, with the comfortable certainty of structures that have been here long enough to stop needing to prove anything. I drove to the estate sale address, which was now a sold house with a dumpster in the driveway and contractors going in and out of the front door. New owners. Renovation already underway. I sat in my car across the street for a while. The tin box was in my coat pocket. I had not formed a specific plan for what to do with it, which is unusual for me and which I think was honest. I had decided to return it to Barrington without deciding exactly how, because deciding exactly how would have been another version of the methodology. Another way of constructing procedure around a choice I had already made, and calling the procedure the thing rather than the wrapper. I got out of the car. I walked to a small park at the end of the block that overlooked the harbor, a narrow strip of grass with 3 benches and a view of the water, and in November, no one in it. I sat on the bench that was furthest from the street. The harbor was gray and flat. A single gull was doing something in the distance that I could not identify. The cold was the specific cold of a New England coastal city in November. The kind that comes off the water and settles in your clothes and does not leave until you have been indoors for 20 minutes. I held the tin box for a while. Then I dug a small hole in the cold ground at the base of the bench with a stick I found near the edge of the grass, shallow, just deep enough, and I put the tin box in the hole and covered it and pressed the turf back down with my palm. It was not hidden in any dramatic sense. Someone could find it easily enough, sitting in the right place with enough attention and a stick. What I was doing was not hiding it. What I was doing was returning it to the condition in which I had found it, in the ground, covered, sealed, waiting. I do not know who put it there the first time. I do not know who it belonged to before the estate's sale, or how it came to be in that house, or whether the person who sealed it and hid it was the person who made it, or someone who found it as I found it and understood, faster than I did, what having it would cost. I know that it was made from the hair of multiple people, and I know that someone wove those strands together with a deliberateness I recognized on the first examination and could not fully account for. And I know that running through the center of it, from one end to the other, was a single white strand that I looked at many times over 6 weeks and always filed under age or shock and moved past. I thought about the white strand sitting on that bench in the November cold. Old hair goes white the way young hair goes white under sustained and profound shock. Completely. All the pigment gone, the structure intact but the color emptied out. I had cataloged this on the first night and assigned it to an old woman, the end of a long life, someone who had been very old when the braid was made. That explanation is possible. It is consistent with the evidence. There is another explanation that is also consistent with the evidence, which is that the white strand belongs to someone who was not old but who had experienced the kind of shock that empties color from hair in a short period of time, which is documented and rare and specific, and which would mean that the white strand is not the hair of the oldest person in the braid, but possibly the youngest, the one for whom the making of the braid came at the highest cost, the one who went into it knowing what they were putting in and what it would do, and who understood in a way that a forensic examiner finding it 70 or 100 years later might not immediately understand, that some things should be sealed and put somewhere they will not be easily found. I do not know if this explanation is correct. I have no way of establishing it. The methodology that would establish it is a methodology I am not going to apply. What I know is that the white strand was always the one I kept coming back to, and that I kept filing it and moving past it, and that this is perhaps the most precise illustration in this entire account of the thing I do professionally and the thing I do personally, and the gap between them, which is that I have spent 30 years finding hidden things and have been much less consistent about sitting with what I find long enough to understand why it was hidden. I walked back to my car. The harbor was still gray. The gull was gone. The contractors were coming in and out of the front door of the house that had been an estate sale 2 months ago, and I watched them for a moment from the sidewalk. The ordinary movement of people doing work in a place that had been someone's life and was now being remade into someone else's. And I thought about what gets kept and what gets released and what gets sealed in a tin box and put in the ground and what that sealing is trying to do. I drove home. The harbor went out of view behind me as I turned onto the highway, and then I was in the gray afternoon of the Providence streets past the old houses on Benefit Street, where my office is, past the coffee shop on the corner, where I go in the mornings, and past the things that are the architecture of my daily life and that I drive past every day and have stopped seeing in the way that you stop seeing things that are reliably present. Margaret's car was in the driveway when I got home. She was in the garden, even in November, doing something with the beds along the south fence, covering things, protecting what could be protected from the cold that was coming. I sat in the car for a moment and watched her through the windshield, her back to me, her hands moving with the specific efficiency of someone who does this work with attention and care and has done it long enough that the movements are natural. She heard the car door. She turned around. She looked at me with the same quality of attention she always brings, the waiting quality. And she raised one hand in a greeting that was also a question. I raised mine back. Then I walked to the garden gate and opened it and went in, which is not something I do often. The garden is Margaret's, in the way that my study is mine, and I have spent 30 years respecting that boundary with a consistency that I have recently begun to understand was not respect so much as a way of staying in my room. She looked at me when I came through the gate. She did not say anything. She was holding a handful of straw mulch, and she looked at me with her full attention the way she does when she has decided to wait. I said, I found something at an estate sale in October. In a tin box. I have been working with it, and I need to tell you what it was and what I did. She looked at me for a long moment. The cold came off the harbor somewhere behind the houses and moved through the garden, and I felt it and did not move. She said, All right. She set the mulch down. She pulled off her gloves. She walked past me to the back step and sat down on it, and she looked at me with the expression I have seen her bring to things she has decided to hear completely, which is an expression I have been on the receiving end of less often than I should have been in 31 years of marriage, and I went and sat next to her on the step. And I told her, not everything, not the documentation or the specific names or the outcomes I cannot confirm or deny, the shape of it, what I had found and what I had understood about it, and what I had done with 6 weeks of having something extraordinary in my hands, what I had not done, what the not doing had shown me about the 31 years before it, and the specific distance that had been a fact of our life together, for as long as I could remember, and that I had never once, in all that time, named as a loss. She listened. She did not interrupt. She is very good at listening, and I have spent 31 years not giving her enough to listen to, which is a different kind of withholding than the kind the braid made available to me, and is, I think, the kind that actually cost us something. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. The garden was around us, the beds covered and waiting, the south fence with its bare climbing roses that would come back in the spring, because Margaret knows how to tend things so they come back. The cold was consistent and without wind. She said, "How long have you known the distance was there?" I said, "A long time. I did not have a word for it until recently." She said, "What word do you have now?" I thought about the white strand. I thought about sealed boxes and the things put inside them and the reasons for the sealing. I thought about 30 years of finding hidden things and the one thing I had been least willing to find. I said, "Absence. I have been absent in a way that I convinced myself was focus." She looked at the garden. She was quiet for long enough that I did not know what she was going to say when she spoke. She said, "I know. I have known for a long time." I said, "I am sorry." She said, "I know that too." We sat on the back step until the light went. It went early in November the way it does, the gray afternoon going gray-dark without a clear transition, the garden going from visible to suggested. Margaret's shoulder was against mine. Neither of us moved inside. We sat and let the dark come the way you sit with something when you have decided to stop managing it from a distance and just let it be the size it actually is. The examination mat is still on my desk. The glassine sheet is still on it. There is nothing under the glassine sheet, and has not been for 3 weeks, but I have not put the mat away. And I have not taken the glassine sheet off it, and I have not replaced them with the next case file the way I normally would when I have finished with a piece of work. I am not sure what I am waiting for. That is not quite true. I think I am waiting to understand what it means that the mat is still there, and I think understanding it requires sitting with the not understanding for a while longer. And I think sitting with the not understanding is something I have not historically been good at, which may be the most important thing this whole account has produced. I am a forensic document examiner. I find the hidden true thing beneath the presented false one. I have been doing this for 30 years. And I am very good at it. And I do not say this with pride, so much as with the simple accuracy of a man who has taken 30 years to become precise about what he is. What I have spent less time being precise about is what the training costs, not professionally, personally. The specific way a mind that is always looking for the thing that has been concealed begins, over time, to apply that, looking to everything, including the things it would rather not find, including the things closest to it, including the 31-year marriage that has been the most consistently present fact of a life that has been otherwise organized around the professional and the procedural. A marriage that has asked of me across all of those years exactly one thing: that I be in the room with her, really in it, not in the room above the kitchen with the examination mat and the archival lamps and the methodology that is always pointing outward, always looking at someone else's hidden thing, always finding the distance between what appears to be true and what actually is. I found the braid in a tin box at an estate sale in Barrington in October. I spent 6 weeks using it in ways that were rigorous and documented and morally indefensible. I put it back in the ground on a gray November Saturday and came home and sat on the back step with my wife until it was too dark to see the garden. And I told her something I should have found a way to tell her a long time ago. and she received it with more patience than I deserved, which is what she has always done, and which I have always accepted without asking myself what it cost her to do it. I have been asking myself that for 3 weeks. I do not have a complete answer. I think the asking is the right direction, and I am going to keep asking. Margaret is in the garden this morning. It is November still, gray and cold, the harbor doing its November thing with the light. I can see her from the window of my study, her back to the house, her hands on the bed, along the south fence, doing something I cannot identify from here, tending something that cannot be seen clearly from a distance. I have been watching her for 10 minutes, and I am about to go downstairs and put my coat on and go out to her. Not because I have something specific to say, but because I have spent 30 years finding reasons to stay in this room, and I think the reasons have run out. The tin box is in the ground in Barrington. The glassine sheet is on the empty mat. The signal lamp, if I still had it, but I am getting confused. There is no signal lamp here. That was Thomas Briggs. And Thomas Briggs is another man in another city on another road. And I am Owen Marsh. And the only thing on my desk is an empty examination mat under a clean sheet of archival glassine. And outside the window, my wife is tending the garden and will look up when she hears the gate, the way she always looks up. She will look up. That is what I know how to do now, that I did not know how to do before. Not the finding, not the examining, not the methodology, just the going downstairs and putting the coat on and opening the gate and being in the garden, really in it, with nothing between me and the person who has been there the whole time. I have spent 30 years finding the hidden true thing. I was looking in the wrong direction. I am going downstairs now. I have spent 22 years learning to look at difficult things without flinching. That was the job. You trained yourself out of the reflex, the way a surgeon trains out of squeamishness, and the way a pilot trains out of the instinct to close their eyes. You looked at what was in front of you clearly, and you documented it and you moved forward. I was good at this. I was known for it. People in my unit used to say that Diane Caulfield could open a box that would put other investigators on leave and be back at her desk in an hour. They meant it as a compliment, and I took it as one. And neither of us understood at the time what I had actually trained myself to do. There was a photograph in a box on my desk in October of 2019. I have thought about it every day since. Not because of what it showed me about the man who took it, because of what it showed me about myself. I want to be precise about what kind of investigator I am, because the kind of investigator I am relevant to everything that follows. I work cold cases, have for 22 years, the last 14 of them in the cold case unit of the Texas Department of Public Safety, housed in a building on the east side of Austin that looks like every other state agency building. Drop ceilings, fluorescent lighting, and the particular institutional carpet that gets replaced every 15 years regardless of condition. My unit reviews unresolved homicides and missing persons cases that have gone inactive, looking for new evidence, new forensic technologies, and new investigative angles that did not exist when the case was originally worked. We are, by definition, the people who look at things that other people have already looked at and found insufficient. I am good at this in a specific way. I am not the investigator who forms emotional connections to cases. Some of my colleagues do. They carry photographs in their wallets, they speak at victims' rights events, and they name their files after the victims rather than the case numbers. I understand this approach, and I respect it, and it is not mine. What I do is read. I read documents the way a radiologist reads imaging, not looking for the thing the original physician noticed, but for the thing they did not. The small inconsistency, the number that should have been higher, the gap in a timeline that everyone downstream accepted without examining, because everyone upstream accepted it first. This is the skill, finding the thing that was hidden in plain sight, because no one was looking for it specifically. I have opened boxes that put other investigators on administrative leave. I have documented material that required the rest of my team to take breaks and step outside. I have read autopsy reports for children and reviewed evidence photographs of things I will not describe here, and gone back to my desk and continued working. I was trained out of the reflex. I trained myself out of it deliberately and systematically over 2 decades. And I was proud of this, and I was right to be. And I did not understand until October of 2019 what the training had actually cost me, what I had trained myself not to see along with everything else. The box came to me on a Tuesday. It had been in storage at a facility in Dallas, transferred to Austin as part of a cold case review initiative that had been in progress for 3 years. It was a standard evidence box, brown cardboard, bar-coded, sealed with evidence tape that had been cut and resealed twice, once in 1994, once in 2011, when a previous investigator had reviewed it and found nothing actionable. The case number was printed on the label. Below it, the subject's name. Below that, a classification code I recognized as interstate homicide, multiple victims suspected. I signed for it at 9 in the morning. I made coffee, I put on gloves, I opened the box. The first thing I do with any cold case box is inventory. Not review, inventory. I make a list of every item present, cross-reference it against the original evidence log, and flag any discrepancies before I touch anything. This takes between 30 minutes and 2 hours depending on the volume of material. It is methodical, and it is unglamorous, and it is the step that most investigators skip when they are impatient to get to the substantive material. It is also the step where I have found the most productive anomalies in 22 years, because the gap between what was logged and what was retained is where oversight lives. The box contained, among other things, a collection of trucking logs. I noted them in my inventory and set them aside. I would come back to them. I always come back to the paper last, because paper rewards patience and punishes rushing, and I have learned to give it the time it requires. I worked through the other material first, the arrest documentation, the forensic reports, the chain of custody records for the physical evidence recovered from the subject's vehicle and residence. Standard procedure, methodical. The box was the record of a man who had driven long-haul routes across the country for approximately 15 years and used the structure of that work, the routes, the schedules, the legitimate professional reason to be on any highway at any hour to do what he did. I knew the broad outlines of the case before the box arrived. Everyone in my field knows the broad outlines. It is the kind of case that gets referenced in training materials, in criminology courses, in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit publications. A long-haul trucker. A compartment was built between the seats of the cab, routes that covered enough geography that the crimes crossed jurisdictions and made pattern recognition difficult. Victims were selected from populations whose disappearances would not immediately generate organized searches. Hitchhikers, runaways, women at truck stops who had no one expecting them anywhere at any particular time. This is the specific horror of that category of predator, not the violence itself, though the violence is real, and I am not minimizing it. The specific horror is the structural logic, the way the legitimate work provides the cover, the way the roots provide the dispersal, the way the victim selection provides the delay, sometimes months, sometimes years, between the act and the report, between the report and the connection, and between the connection and the name. He had been doing it, by his own account when finally questioned, for 15 years. 15 years of routes and logs and way stations and truck stop diners and CB radio chatter and every ordinary texture of a working life, and underneath it, running parallel to it the whole time, the other thing. I have worked cases like this before. Not at this scale, few cases reach this scale, but the structural pattern is not unfamiliar to me. I approached the box the way I approach all boxes. Methodically, without flinching. I came to the trucking logs in the early afternoon. A DOT trucking log from that era is a standard paper form. Columns for date, origin, destination, odometer readings at departure and arrival, and total miles for the day. The subject had been meticulous about his logs, more meticulous than required actually, which is a detail that had been noted in the original investigation and then not followed up on in any depth. Predators who are organized enough to maintain a cover over years are often meticulous about the documentation that supports that cover. The logs were a performance of normalcy, and he had performed it carefully. I read through them in chronological order, and in the third month of the period in question, I found what the previous reviewer had not found. Or had found and not registered, or had registered and not known what to do with. The mileage was short, not dramatically short, not short enough to jump out at a tired investigator working through a dense box on a Friday afternoon. Short by the kind of margin that only registers as significant if you know the routes, know the expected distances, know that the gap between logged miles and actual miles on that particular stretch of Interstate 70 through central Illinois amounts to approximately 2 hours of unaccounted time. I noted it. I flagged it in my documentation with a reference to the relevant dates. I would come back to it. I set the logs aside and reached for the next category of material in the box. The photographs were in a manila envelope at the bottom. I want to be clear about something. I had been told the box contained photographs. This was in the original evidence log. It was not a surprise. I have reviewed evidence photographs in more cases than I can count over 22 years. And I had already reviewed the forensic photographs earlier in the morning without incident. I reached for the envelope with the same professional attention I had brought to everything else in the box. I removed the photographs, I began to review them in order. I will not describe most of what is in those photographs. What I will tell you is that near the end of the sequence, there is one that is different from the others. The others document things, the progression of captivity, the evidence of what was being done, the clinical photographic record of a predator who documented his work with the thoroughness of a man who believed he would never be caught. They are terrible in a way that I can describe as professional, terrible in the way that all evidence of sustained violence is terrible, terrible in a way that 22 years of training allows you to absorb and process and set aside. The last photograph is different. It is an image of a girl in a barn. She is wearing a dress and heels that are not her clothes that were put on her, selected for her, part of a staging that I recognized immediately from the forensic reports. She has short hair that is also not her hair, cut during the period of captivity by the man behind the camera. She is standing in the barn with her hands raised, not quite covering her face, not quite a gesture of defense, not quite anything that has a clean name. She is looking directly into the camera and her face. I set the photograph down on my desk. I did not look away from it. Looking away would have been a response, and I do not respond, I observe. I sat in the fluorescent light of my office with the photograph on the desk in front of me, and I looked at her face, and I felt something shift in the architecture of a room I had kept locked for 22 years. I was 19 years old the summer after my first year at Texas Tech. I was driving back to Amarillo from a French apartment in Lubbock when my car died on Route 84, 4 miles outside of Slayton, in the flat particular heat of a West Texas July with no cell service and nothing in any direction but scrubland and the road and the sky. I stood by the car for 20 minutes before a truck pulled over. He was polite. He was unremarkable. He drove me to the Slayton bus station without incident and let me out and drove away. And I caught the bus and went home and told my mother my car had broken down and did not mention the truck because there was nothing to mention. Nothing had happened. He had been polite. He had let me out at the bus station. I was fine. I have told myself this for 22 years. I sat in my office in October of 2019 and looked at the face of a girl in a barn. And for the first time in 22 years, I let myself remember what I had noticed in that truck and immediately, deliberately, trained myself not to think about again. The way the cab was laid out, the quality of the silence when the door closed. The small things that were wrong that I had cataloged and filed and sealed away with the same efficiency that I later learned to bring to evidence boxes. Because I was 19 and alone and 4 miles from Slayton in the July heat, and the correct response, the survival response, was to be unremarkable, to not show that I had noticed, to be the kind of passenger who would not be worth stopping for. I looked at the girl in the photograph. She was not being unremarkable. She was past the point where that was available to her. What I recognized in her face was not fear. I have seen fear in evidence photographs before. What I recognized was the specific expression of a person who has just understood something completely and has no remaining mechanism for not understanding it. A kind of terrible clarity. The expression of someone who has run out of the story they were telling themselves about what was happening and has arrived at the plain fact of it, with nothing left to put between themselves and the fact. I had not seen that expression in 22 years. The last time I saw it was in a rest stop bathroom mirror in Slayton, Texas. After the truck drove away and I was safe, looking at my own face and understanding something I spent the next 2 decades learning not to have understood. I picked up the photograph. I noted the case reference number in my log. I placed it in the documentation pile, and I stood up and I walked to the window, and I looked at the parking lot for a long time. Then I went back to my desk. Because I am Diane Caulfield. Because I am a cold case investigator with 22 years of experience, and a unit that depends on my ability to look at what other people cannot look at and come back to my desk and continue working. Because there was still material in the box and the mileage discrepancy in the trucking logs needed to be followed up and documented. I went back to my desk. I continued working. I did not flinch. That is what I am telling you when I say I did not understand what the training had cost me. I did not flinch. I went back to my desk. I completed the inventory. I wrote up the mileage discrepancy and attached it to the file. I drove home on the interstate in the dark with the long trucks in the lanes around me, moving the way they always move, steady and unhurried and constant, and I counted the miles on my odometer without meaning to, and I could not stop counting. And I told myself this was normal, this was professional, this was exactly what 22 years of training had prepared me to do. I have not driven on the interstate at night since October of 2019. I take surface roads now. I have not told anyone why. I want to tell you what I did not do after I got home from the office that night. I did not call the FBI tip line. I did not contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I did not call my lieutenant, or the cold case coordinator for the region, or the victim advocate attached to my unit, who I had worked alongside for 11 years, and who I trusted completely. I did not do any of the things that 22 years of training and institutional protocol and professional obligation told me to do when a review of an evidence box produces a significant finding. What I did was drive home on the interstate in the dark with the long trucks in the lanes around me, and count the miles on my odometer without meaning to, and park in my driveway, and sit in the car for a while with the engine off, and then go inside and stand in my kitchen for a long time without turning on the light. I want to be precise about why. The mileage discrepancy in the trucking logs was a legitimate finding. It was documented, flagged, and attached to the case file. That part was done correctly, and I have no doubt about that part. What the mileage discrepancy meant, specifically, what those 2 unaccounted hours on that stretch of Interstate 70 through Central Illinois represented, was not something I had finished processing when I drove home. I knew what it meant professionally. I could write the supplemental report in my sleep. 2 hours of unlogged time on a route the subject drove regularly. In the period covered by the indictment, in a geographic area where there were 3 open missing persons cases, with profiles consistent with his established victim selection pattern. I knew what it meant. I had known what it meant within 40 minutes of finding it. What I had not finished processing was the photograph. I want to be careful here. The way I have been trained to be careful when I am working close to something that is also personal because careful is what I know how to be, and because I am aware that careful can be a way of not saying the thing directly. So I am going to say it directly. I drove home on the interstate in the dark, and I counted the miles without meaning to, and I sat in my car in the driveway, and I stood in my kitchen without turning on the light, because the photograph had opened something that 22 years of professional training had been very efficiently keeping closed. And what was coming through the opening was not something I could process and file and supplement report and move forward from in a single afternoon. The girl in the photograph. Her face. The specific expression. I have described it already, and I am not going to describe it again, because describing it is not the point, and was never the point. The point is what I recognized in it. The point is what I saw in that expression that I had not seen in 22 years, since I stood in a rest stop bathroom mirror in Slayton, Texas, and looked at my own face after the truck drove away, and understood something I spent the next 2 decades training myself not to have understood. I stood in my kitchen in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. A car went past on the street outside. I pressed my thumb into my palm and held it there, and I tried to think about what I needed to do next, which is what I always do when I am inside something I cannot see the edges of. I make a list of the next actions. I identify the most immediate obligation, and I attend to it. I have done this for 22 years, and it has served me well, and it was not serving me in the kitchen in the dark, and I could not figure out why. What I eventually understood, standing there, was this. In 22 years of cold case work, I had never once been inside one of my own cases. I had always been on the outside of the file, reading about what happened to other people, finding the gaps in other people's timelines, identifying the 2 missing hours in someone else's route. I was very good at being outside the file. I was possibly the best in my unit at being outside the file. And what the photograph had done, in the space of however long I stood in front of it in my office with the fluorescent lights on, and the evidence box open on my desk, was put me inside the file. Not inside the girl's file. Inside my own, I had a file. I had always had a file. I had just never opened it. The next morning, I went back to the office, and I wrote the supplemental report on the mileage discrepancy, and I submitted it through the correct channels, and I did everything I was supposed to do in exactly the order I was supposed to do it. The finding was significant, and the unit coordinator agreed it was significant, and it was forwarded to the relevant federal contacts within 48 hours. I did my job. I have always done my job. Then I asked for 2 days of personal leave, and I drove south on I-35 towards San Antonio and turned west on Route 87 and drove until I reached the town of Slayton, Texas, which I had not been to since the summer I was 19 years old. I want to tell you about that drive. It was November, 4 weeks after I closed the evidence box on my desk and initialed the chain of custody form and returned it to the storage coordinator. The Texas landscape in November has a quality that I think only people who have driven it understand from the inside. The flatness of it. The sky so wide and uninterrupted that it seems to be pressing the land down. The brown of the grasses along the highway. The occasional water tower or grain elevator that appears on the horizon 20 minutes before you reach it. and disappears in the rearview mirror 20 minutes after. I grew up in this landscape and spent my adult life in Austin, which is large enough and hilly enough and full enough of people that you can forget the flatness exists. Driving back into it felt like remembering something my body had been holding for a long time without my permission. I stopped in Sweetwater for coffee at a gas station that had been a different gas station when I was young and was now a franchise with fluorescent lighting and a self-serve machine that gave me something that tasted approximately like coffee, if I did not think too hard about it. I sat in the car in the parking lot and drank it and watched a truck pull in from the highway and stop at the pumps. A large truck, dark blue. The driver got out and went inside without looking in my direction, and I watched him go, and my hands were completely still on the cup, which is not the same thing as my hands being fine. I drove south and west. The sky was doing something in the distance, a quality of afternoon light on the flat land that made the horizon look slightly unreal. The kind of light that photographers drive hours to find. I noticed it in the abstract way. You notice beautiful things when you are driving toward something you have not let yourself drive toward for 22 years. It registered and I noted it, and I kept driving. Slayton is a small town 30 kilometers southeast of Lubbock. The kind of town the interstate bypassed decades ago, and that exists now in the quiet of places that have stopped being on the way to anywhere. I drove through the main street, which had a hardware store and a pharmacy and a diner with a sign I did not recognize, and a barber shop that I thought I might have seen before and was not certain. The bus station was still there. Smaller than I remembered, or the same size, and I had been smaller when I last saw it. A flat-roofed building on the south side of a block that had two other businesses on it, both closed. I parked in front of it and sat there for a moment. The bus station in Slayton, Texas, where I was 19 years old, standing with a bag over my shoulder after a truck had let me out and driven away, and I had watched it go and gone inside and bought a ticket to Amarillo and sat on a plastic chair and waited. I had not told anyone about the truck. I had not told anyone because there was nothing to tell, because nothing had happened, because the man had been polite and driven me where I needed to go and let me out and driven away, because I was fine. I got out of the car. The bus station was open. There was a woman behind the counter who looked up when I came in and then looked back down at what she was doing. There were 3 plastic chairs along one wall, orange, the same shade of orange as the chairs I remembered, though these were clearly not the same chairs. A schedule board on the wall with routes that no longer included Lubbock, which meant the route I had taken that summer did not exist anymore. I sat down in one of the orange chairs. I want to tell you what I was trying to do by coming here, because I have thought about it a great deal in the 4 weeks since I sat in that chair, and I think I understand it now in a way I did not understand it when I was doing it. I was not looking for evidence. I was not conducting an investigation. I was not doing anything that my training could account for, or that I could file a report about when it was finished. What I was doing, I think, is something that 22 years of professional life had trained me to believe was unnecessary. I was going back to the scene, not to find something, just to stand in it. Just to be in the place where the thing happened and let the place be real in the way that photographs in evidence files are not real, in the way that case files and supplemental reports and mileage discrepancies in trucking logs are not real. Just to let the size of it be the actual size, instead of the size it becomes when you put it in a file and close the file and spend 22 years being very competent and very closed about it on the other side of every desk you have ever sat at. The woman behind the counter asked if I needed a ticket. I said, "No, thank you. I am just sitting for a minute." She looked at me for a moment with the practiced assessment of someone who works in a bus station and has learned to read the specific quality of people who come in to sit rather than to travel. Then she looked back down at what she was doing and left me alone. I sat in the orange chair. The bus station smelled of something industrial and slightly floral. That was probably a cleaning product. The fluorescent light above me had a flicker that was almost imperceptible, the kind you would not notice unless the room was very quiet and you were sitting very still. I sat very still. I was 19 years old in this room. I had just been in a truck with a man who had been polite and driven me where I needed to go and let me out and driven away, and I had come in here and bought a ticket and sat in a chair and waited. And my hands had been steady the whole time, and I had told myself I was fine because I was fine, because nothing had happened, because being fine and nothing having happened were the same thing. I understood. In the orange chair under the flickering light in the Slayton bus station, that they had never been the same thing. That something had happened, which was that I had been in a truck with a man who was capable of the things I had spent 22 years documenting in evidence files, and I had known it in the way that the body knows things before the mind decides to know them. And I had been 19 years old and alone, and I had done the only thing available to me, which was to make myself as unremarkable as possible and wait for the door to open, and it had opened, and I had walked out, and I had been fine. And being fine had cost me 22 years of keeping 2 rooms separate. Not consciously. I want to be precise about that, because I have spent enough time in this field to understand the difference between deliberate suppression and the kind of structural avoidance that a person does not experience as avoidance, because it is built into the architecture of their professional life. I did not decide to be a cold case investigator in order to avoid what happened in that truck. I did not construct a career as a mechanism for managing something I refused to examine. I became a cold case investigator because I was good at it and because it mattered and because the work was real and important, and I have never once doubted that. But the two things are not mutually exclusive. A person can do work that is real and important and good, and that work can also be, underneath its own legitimacy, a way of being on the correct side of the file. The side that reads and documents and finds the gap. The side that is outside the thing that happened, looking in. I had been outside for 22 years. The photograph put me inside. I sat in the orange chair until the light outside the window went the flat gold of a Texas late afternoon. And then I got up and thanked the woman behind the counter, who looked up and nodded without expression, and I went out to my car and sat in it for a while before I started it. The main street of Slayton was quiet. A pickup truck went past. A dog crossed at the far end of the block. The water tower had the town's name on it, in letters that were newer than the tower itself, repainted at some point in the last decade by someone who wanted the name to be legible from the highway. I looked at the bus station one more time through the windshield. The orange chairs were visible through the window. The woman behind the counter was still there. The fluorescent light, with its almost imperceptible flicker, was still going. I started the car and drove north toward Lubbock and then east toward home. I did not count the miles on the way back. I noticed, somewhere outside of Sweetwater, that I was not counting them, and I stayed with that for a while. The way you stay with something small that turns out to be the first evidence of a larger thing shifting. I drove home. The interstate was what the interstate is at night, flat and lit, and full of long trucks moving steadily through the dark. I watched them the way I always watch them, and I felt what I always feel, and I did not look away. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, and I counted the exits instead of the miles, which is not the same as being fine, but is a different thing than I had managed the month before, and I think the difference is real, even if I cannot yet tell you exactly what it means. I transferred out of cold case 4 months after I closed that evidence box. Not because of the photograph, or not only because of the photograph, and not because the work had stopped mattering, because it had not. I transferred because I had spent 22 years developing an expertise in finding the gap in other people's timelines, and I had finally found the gap in my own, and I could not figure out how to do both at the same time. I could not figure out how to sit across a desk from a file that contained someone's worst thing and bring to it the clean, professional attention it deserved when my own worst thing was sitting in the room with me and had been sitting in the room with me the whole time. I am in the Crimes Against Persons unit now, live cases. Active investigations, witnesses who are in front of me rather than in a box. It is different work, and I am learning it at 51, which is not the age at which most investigators start learning new things, and I am slower at it than I was at cold case in my prime, and I do not mind that. The slowness is honest. The slowness is appropriate for where I am. I have a new partner named Sylvia who is 33 years old and was assigned to me by a lieutenant who told her, what I believe was genuine goodwill, that I was one of the best case readers he had ever worked with. Sylvia received this information with the polite skepticism of a 33-year-old who has not yet seen what I can do. And I find her skepticism bracing rather than insulting, which may be the clearest evidence that I have changed. In some way I am still mapping. She asked me last week, in the car between a witness interview and the office, where I had worked before this unit. I said, cold case, 22 years. She said, what made you leave? I thought about the orange chairs in the Slayton bus station. I thought about the mileage discrepancy in the trucking logs and the photograph and the long drive south on I-35. I thought about standing in my kitchen in the dark and not turning on the light, and sitting in my car in the driveway and counting things I had not meant to count. I thought about 22 years of keeping 2 rooms separate, and what it had cost to do that, and what it cost to stop. I said I found something I had been looking for a long time. and it was time to look at something else. Sylvia looked at me for a moment, with the assessing quality that I think she is not fully aware of yet. The thing she has that will make her very good at this work, if she stays in it long enough. Then she looked back at the road, she said. That sounds like there is more to it, I said. There is. She did not push. She is 33, and she has the instinct already. The one that tells you when to press, and when to let the silence do the work. I noted this about her, and I did not say anything, because some things you do better by noticing than by naming. I have been thinking about the girl in the photograph, not every day, not the way I thought about her in the first weeks, when she was in every quiet room I walked into, and behind every door I opened, and in the specific quality of every interstate at night. Less than that now. More honestly than that now, if honest is the word. If thinking about something with your full attention, rather than through the glass of a professional framework, is a version of honesty. I think it is. I think it might be the most important version. What I think about when I think about her is not what happened to her. That is in the file, and it is documented, and it is as known as it is ever going to be, which is not fully known, which is the nature of these files, and always will be. What I think about is the expression, the one I recognized, the specific quality of a person who has run out of the story they were telling themselves about what was happening and has arrived at the plain fact of it. I know that expression from the inside. I know what it costs to arrive at the plain fact of something. I know what it costs to look at yourself in a rest stop bathroom mirror in Slayton, Texas, and understand something you are immediately going to spend 22 years not having understood. I do not think my understanding of that expression makes me a better investigator in any way I can specify or measure or put in a report. I think it makes me a different one. I think it means that when I open a file now, I am aware that the gap I am looking for is not only in the timeline. It is in the distance between what the person knew and what they were able to act on. Between what the body understood and what the mind was allowed to name. That distance is where everything important lies. I know this because I measured it in miles on a highway in the dark and found it longer than I expected. I am still measuring. The interstate at night is what it has always been. Flat and lit and full of long trucks moving steadily westward. Their running lights amber in the dark, patient and unhurried, covering distance, the way distance gets covered when you have accepted that the road is long and there is nothing to do but stay on it. I drive it in the dark sometimes now, not always, not without noticing what I feel when the trucks are in the lanes around me. But I drive it. I keep my hands on the wheel. I keep my eyes on the road ahead. I watch the mile markers go past, and I let them go without counting, which is a small thing, and I know it is a small thing, and I am not claiming it is more than it is. It is what I have right now. Some nights it is enough. I have spent 8 years telling people what their houses mean. Not in a mystical sense, in a professional one. The ceiling height in your living room affects your cortisol levels. The distance between your kitchen and your front door shapes how you feel when you come home. You avoid the room without knowing why. The room with the thing in it is almost always you are not ready to name. I know this. I have known it for 8 years, and I have been paid well for knowing it. And I walked into Daniel's house on a Tuesday evening in October 3 years ago, and I read every room in it correctly, and I chose, very deliberately, not to say what I read. I am still working out what to call that. I am still working out a lot of things from somewhere that is not that house, 6 weeks after I left it. Let me tell you what I do, because it matters to everything that follows. I am a residential interior designer. Have been for 8 years, the last 5 of them independent, working out of a studio in the Pearl District that I share with a structural engineer named Pam, who brings terrible coffee and excellent judgment to every project we collaborate on. My work is not decorative. People sometimes assume it is, that what I do is select upholstery and argue about hardware finishes, and I let them assume this because correcting it takes longer than the conversation usually warrants. What I actually do is read how people live in space and tell them what their space is doing back to them. The ceiling in your bedroom is 4 inches lower than the rest of the house, and you wake up tense every morning and cannot explain why. The kitchen triangle in your open plan is laid out in a way that puts your back to the room whenever you cook, which is why you feel excluded from your own family at dinner time, even though you are technically present. The room your teenager has been avoiding for 6 months has north-facing windows and receives no direct light after 10 in the morning, and that is not the whole story, but it is part of it. I understand what spaces communicate. I have been paid well for this understanding. I have spent 8 years developing a professional language for what built environments do to the people who live inside them. And I am telling you this at the outset, because what I am about to describe is a failure of that language. Not a failure of the language itself, a failure to use it. A deliberate, sustained 14-month refusal to apply to my own life the exact set of tools I had spent 8 years building, because the thing those tools would have told me was something I did not want to know. I met Daniel at a project consultation in the West Hills in October 3 years ago. He was a friend of the client's, a structural engineer by training, who had spent the previous 4 years restoring, a craftsman on the hill above Burnside, and he came to the consultation because my clients had asked him to look at a load-bearing question that had come up in their own renovation. He stayed for the walkthrough. He asked good questions, the kind of questions that come from someone who understands buildings structurally and is curious about the layer above structure, about what a space communicates once the engineering is settled. We talked for 2 hours after the clients had gone to put the children to bed. He drove me to my car. 2 weeks later, he invited me to see the craftsman. I want to be precise about what I experienced when I walked into that house, because precision is the discipline I was trained in, and it is the only thing I have left that still feels like solid ground. I walked through the front door on a Tuesday evening in October, and the house was everything I had not had when I was growing up. Not in a sentimental sense, in a spatial one. The proportions were correct. The original fir floors had been, refinished with something that let the grain show without flattening it. The light fixtures were period appropriate. without being costume. Every threshold between rooms was considered. The way a space transitioned from one use to another without jarring. The way the house moved you through itself with a kind of quiet intention that I recognized immediately as the product of someone who had thought very carefully about how a human body experiences built space. I stood in the entry hall, and I read the whole house in approximately 90 seconds. And what I read was, "This is the most controlled environment I have ever walked into." I told Daniel it was the most intentional space I had ever seen. He smiled. He said he had spent 4 years getting it right. I want you to understand that these are the same sentences. Controlled and intentional are the same observation from two different positions. One clinical, one admiring. I had the clinical language, and I used the admiring version, and I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway. Because I was standing in a house that felt, in every fiber of its restored and considered fabric, like the opposite of the life I had grown up in. My mother moved us 5 times before I was 12. I live in 7 cities. I have never unpacked all my boxes in any apartment I have rented because some part of me has always been ready to leave before I was asked to. Daniel's house was not a house that was ready to leave. Daniel's house had been here for 110 years and had been restored with a precision that communicated in every detail that it intended to be here for another 110. I fell in love with the house before I finished the walkthrough. I fell in love with Daniel later, and more slowly, and I think now that I may have confused the two things for longer than I should have. We married 14 months ago. I moved into the house the week before the wedding. There is a room at the end of the upstairs hall that is always locked. I noticed it on the first walkthrough 3 years ago. Daniel said it was storage, renovation materials, things he had not yet decided where to put. I noted it professionally. North-facing, probably small. The door a later addition that did not quite match the millwork of the originals. I moved past it. In the following 3 years of visits and then of living in the house, I passed through that door hundreds of times. It was always locked. Daniel did not mention it. I did not ask. I am trying to be honest about why I did not ask. Because I think the honest answer is complicated, and I think it matters. Part of it was that I had learned, early in our relationship, that there were questions Daniel received easily, and questions he received in a way that was harder to describe. Not anger, exactly. A quality of stillness. A way of looking at me that was very calm and very direct, and that communicated, without words, that the question had been noticed. The first time I saw that quality, we had been together, perhaps 4 months. It was in response to something I had said about a colleague of his at a dinner, a woman I had asked about in passing. The quality lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he smiled and changed the subject, and the evening continued, and I told myself I had imagined it. I'm a person who reads spaces. I am not always equally good at reading silences. Part of it, the larger part, if I am being honest, was that I did not want to know. I had lived in that house for 14 months by the time I found the key, and in those 14 months it had become, despite everything, the most permanent place I had ever inhabited. My studio drafting table was in the second bedroom. My reference library was on the built-in shelves in the study. My coffee mug was in the cabinet to the left of the range, which was where I liked it. And it was always in that cabinet because Daniel noticed things like that and returned them to where they belonged. I unpacked all of my boxes. For the first time in my adult life, I had unpacked all of my boxes. I found the key on a Wednesday in November. Daniel was in Seattle for 2 days for a structural consultation. I was in the kitchen making tea, and I moved the cutting board to clean under it. Something I do periodically, a habit from childhood, when my mother's kitchens were always the rooms that needed the most management. And behind the cutting board, fitted into a small gap in the tile backsplash where the grout had pulled away from the wall, was a key. Not a modern key, a skeleton key, old brass, the kind used in interior door locks in houses built before 1930. The kind used in every original door lock in a craftsman of this house's age. I held it for a while. I set it on the counter. I poured my tea. I stood in the kitchen that I had read correctly on the first night I walked into it, and I looked at the key, and I understood that finding it had been, in some sense, a decision point, and that I had approximately as long as it took to drink my tea to decide which way I was going to go. I drank the tea. I picked up the key. I went upstairs. The room was small, north-facing, as I had assessed from the exterior, perhaps 10 by 12, with a single window looking out toward the street. The glass original and wavy in the way that old glass is. The kind of glass that makes the world outside look like it is slightly underwater. There was nothing in the room except a wooden chair, and on the floor beside the chair, a journal. Hardcover, like the kind sold in stationery shops. It was not new. The cover was worn at the corners with the specific wear of something that has been handled frequently over a long period of time. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I entered the room. I want to be honest about this moment too. I am a person who reads spaces professionally, and the space I was reading told me very clearly that the room had been repainted recently. Within the past year, I could tell by the slight chemical undertone beneath the older smell of wood and dust and closed air. The color was a neutral white. But in the corner behind the door, where a roller does not reach evenly, there was a strip of the old color showing through. A specific, unremarkable beige. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at that strip of color, and I felt, for reasons I could not immediately name, like I was 9 years old and standing in the hallway of my mother's apartment in Spokane, waiting to be told we were moving again. I know now what that feeling was telling me. I did not know it then. I stepped into the room. The journal was not Daniel's handwriting. It was a woman's writing, neat and slightly left-leaning. The kind of handwriting that suggests someone who was taught careful penmanship and maintained the habit. The first entry was dated 3 years and 2 months ago. The name at the top of the first page was Louise. Her last name was Vance. I sat down in the wooden chair and I began to read. The early entries were warm. She wrote about the house the way I had thought about it when I first walked in, with a specific, almost physical relief at having found something solid. She was a landscape architect. She understood built environments from the outside, the way I understood them from the inside, and she wrote about the garden she was planning for the west side of her house with the same precision I recognized from my own professional notes. She wrote about Daniel with affection. She wrote about feeling, for the first time in a long time, like she had found a place that would hold her. The third entry mentioned briefly a conversation about what she had worn to a colleague's birthday dinner. She had not thought anything of it at the time, she wrote. He was just particular. He had good taste. She had good taste too, and did not mind the input. The seventh entry mentioned that she had not spoken to her sister in 3 weeks. I sat in the wooden chair in the north-facing room, and I read the journal from the first page to the last, and the last entry was dated 14 months and 3 days before I moved into this house, and it was 4 words long. The handwriting different from all the entries before it, larger and less controlled, as if written quickly or in the dark. I cannot find the door. I closed the journal. I set it back on the floor exactly where I had found it. I stood up from the chair and I walked to the corner behind the door, and I looked at the strip of old color showing through the fresh white paint, and I stood there for a long time. Then I went downstairs. I put the key back in the gap in the tile backsplash. I pushed the cutting board back into place. I picked up my phone and I looked at it for a moment, at Daniel's name in my contacts. At the last message he had sent that morning, a photograph of the view from his Seattle hotel room, with the caption, "Thinking of you," and I set the phone face down on the counter. I am a person who reads spaces. I am a person who understands, professionally and structurally, what a built environment communicates to the people inside it. I walked into this house 3 years ago, and I read it correctly in 90 seconds, and I have spent 3 years choosing the admiring word instead of the clinical one, because the clinical word would have required me to act on it, and I did not want to leave. I stood in the kitchen of the most intentional house I have ever inhabited, and I understood, for the first time since I moved in, that intention and control are not opposites of chaos. They are just a different kind of it, and that a room you cannot find the door to is still a room, regardless of how beautiful the house around it is, regardless of how carefully the floors have been refinished, regardless of how permanently the whole structure sits on its foundation, unmovable, exactly as it has always been, exactly as it intends to remain. I picked up my phone. I did not call Daniel. I called Pam, my structural engineer, who answered on the second ring and said nothing for a long moment after I told her what I had found, and then said, "How fast can you pack? I have not been in that house for 6 weeks. I am still working out what I know. I am still working out the order of things, what I saw first and chose not to name, what came later, what I explained away, and how what the house was telling me from the beginning in the only language it had, the language of locked rooms and stripped paint, and the specific weight of a silence when a question lands wrong. What I know is this. Louise Vance was a landscape architect who understood built environments from the outside. I am a residential interior designer who understands them from the inside. We were both trained to read what spaces communicate. We both walked into that house and read it correctly, and chose, for different reasons and at different moments, not to say what we read. I do not know what happened to Louise Vance. I have looked. I have found very little. I have found that she does not appear in any professional directory after 14 months and 3 days before I moved in. I have found that her landscape architecture license in the state of Oregon lapsed without renewal 6 months after the last entry in that journal. I have found that there is no forwarding address on file with the Oregon State Bar associated with any legal proceeding involving her name, which means if there was a divorce, it was handled in a jurisdiction I have not yet identified, or it was handled in some other way. I am still looking. I think about the 4 words at the end of that journal every day. I think about the strip of old color in the corner where the roller did not reach, the specific beige of the hallway of an apartment in Spokane that I have not thought about in 20 years, and I think about what it is that makes a person recognize a thing too late, whether it is the training, whether it is the wanting, whether the house and the person inside it get so tangled together that by the time you can see one clearly, you have lost the other entirely. I unpacked all of my boxes in that house. It is the only home in my adult life where I did that. I drove away 6 weeks ago with the things that fit in my car, and the rest of it is still there, in the rooms I chose, on the shelves I built, in the cabinet to the left of the range. My coffee mug is in that cabinet right now. I know this because I know where it belongs, and I know Daniel will have put it back. I have not gone back for it. I do not think I am going to. I have spent 39 years asking the same question, not out loud mostly, in the way you ask a question that you already know has no answer, quietly, and at night, and with the specific exhaustion of a person who cannot stop asking it anyway. The question is this: what happened inside that cab? Not what the inquiry concluded. Not the most probable cause. The most plausible scenario. The best available explanation given the evidence recovered from the wreckage. What actually happened in the cab of locomotive 55AT6 between the moment the approach signal came into view and the moment the fireball ended the conversation forever? I designed the warning system that told them to stop. It worked correctly. They did not stop. I am the only person still alive who knows what I was doing the morning before. I want to be precise about what I do, because the precision matters to everything that follows. I am a signal systems engineer. Was formerly. I retired from Canadian National 11 years ago, after 31 years of service, at a small ceremony in the Edmonton divisional offices where someone had ordered a sheet cake, and my supervisor said things about my career that were accurate and kind. I have a certificate somewhere. I have not looked for it recently. What I have on my desk, and have had on my desk for 30 years, is a signal lamp, an amber lens 4 inches in diameter, the kind used in approach signal housing on the main line subdivisions through the Alberta foothills. The kind that displays yellow over red. The kind that means slow down and prepare to stop. The next signal is red. I tell people it is a reference piece. This is true. I have used it to explain signal systems to engineers, to students, to inquiry commissioners, and to anyone who needs to understand what the warning architecture looks like from the inside. I held it up and I said, this is what they saw. This color, this brightness. From this distance, at that speed, a crew has approximately 45 seconds of approach signal visibility before they reach the home signal. 45 seconds is enough time to begin braking. The system is designed around that margin. The margin is sufficient. I know this because I designed it. What I do not say when I hold up the lamp is that I sometimes look at it at night, when the room is dark and the lamp is the only light source, and I try to see it the way a person in a cab might see it, whether the color is as unambiguous as I have always believed, whether the intensity, from the distance at which it first becomes visible, is the quality of a warning that a person cannot miss, or the quality of a warning that a person might, in certain conditions, in a certain state, fail to register at the level of response. I know what the answer is. The answer is that the signal is unambiguous. The inquiry established this. I established this. Every technical expert who examined Signal 1703 in the weeks after February 8, 1986, confirmed that it was functioning correctly, displaying correctly, and visible at the required distance with the required clarity. The signal was not the problem. I look at the lamp anyway. Let me tell you what I knew about the Edson to Jasper subdivision on the morning of February 8th, 1986, which is to say what I had certified about it 11 days before. Signal 1703 is located at mile 170.6 on the westbound main line, 2.5 miles east of the Dalehurst control point. It is an approach signal. Its function is to warn an approaching crew that the next signal, the home signal at Dalehurst, is displaying a restrictive indication and that they should reduce speed to 30 miles per hour and prepare to stop. Hudson overrode the dead man's switch by placing a lunchbox on the pedal. The dead man's pedal, the device that required an engineer to maintain foot pressure in order to keep the train moving, and that would trigger an alarm and automatic braking if released, had been circumvented. This detail was established in the inquiry. Whether it was circumvented that morning, on that specific run, cannot be confirmed because the locomotive was destroyed in the impact. But the practice was known, it was common, it was tolerated. Yes. You can go. I certified Signal 1703 on January 28, 1986, 11 days before the collision. My inspection documented correct lamp operation, correct lens color, correct visibility distance, and correct aspect display for the relevant track conditions. I signed the form. I drove back to Edmonton. The signal went on displaying yellow over red to every westbound train that passed it in the following 11 days, and every crew that passed it responded correctly, and nothing happened, which is what is supposed to happen. On the morning of February 7th, 1986, I drove west on Highway 16 toward a site inspection at a signal installation near Miette. I passed the signal at the 1703 location from the highway. The approach signal housing is visible from the road, not the aspect itself, which is oriented to the track, but the housing, the mast, the structure. I have driven that highway hundreds of times. I know every signal location on that subdivision the way you know the landmarks on a route you have driven for years. I did not stop. There was no reason to stop. The signal had been certified 11 days earlier, and there had been no fault reports, no anomalies in the test data, and no indication of any kind that anything was wrong. I drove past. I went to my inspection. I drove home in the late afternoon on the same highway, past the same signal location, heading east as the winter light went out of the sky somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, the way it does in February in Alberta. I made dinner, I watched some television, I went to bed. The next morning, February 8th, 1986, at approximately 8:40 in the morning, in the mountains west of the town of Hinton, at a combined speed of 108 miles per hour. The Via Rail Supercontinental Passenger Train and Canadian National Train 413 collided head-on the single-line section of the Jasper subdivision. Outside online, the freight train entered the single main line, where the uncontrolled freight train failed to stop for restrictive signals. Signal 1703 had displayed yellow over red. The home signal at Dalehurst had displayed all red. Tests confirmed that the signals worked correctly, and all lights displayed the correct colors. Outside online, the inquiry reached its conclusions. Investigators determined that the crew of the freight train failed to respond to the signals for unknown reasons. Outside online unknown reasons, I want to sit with those two words for a moment, the way I have been sitting with them for 39 years, because they are the most precise and the most terrible conclusion the inquiry could have reached. Not wrong reasons, not bad reasons, unknown reasons. The inquiry had 150 witnesses and 56 days of testimony, and the full resources of the Canadian federal government, and the best it could do, the most accurate thing it could say, was that the crew of Freight Train 413 failed to respond to clearly displayed and correctly functioning warning signals for reasons that could not be determined. The Commission of Inquiry utilized forensic data retrieval from locomotive event recorders and hot box detectors to establish Train 413 speeds and timestamps. Autopsies and toxicological tests on deceased crew members detected no alcohol or drugs in their systems at the time of impact. Outside online, the engineer, John Hudson, slept for only 3 hours and 30 minutes, and the co-engineer slept for 5 hours. But even then, he was unable to sleep properly due to a cold. Yes, you can go sleep. The most plausible explanation. 2 men in a cab in the dark of a February morning in the Alberta foothills. 3.5 hours of sleep between them on a locomotive with its safety pedal weighted down with a lunchbox on a route they had both run many times before, in the specific numbness of deep fatigue on a familiar road. The inquiry considered this. Most investigators considered it the most probable cause. A man can fall asleep and not know he is falling asleep. A man can be awake by every physiological measure and still be operating at a level of cognitive function that is, for the purposes of responding to a warning signal, indistinguishable from sleep. I know this. I have read everything there is to read about fatigue and cognitive impairment and the specific failure modes of the human attention system under conditions of sleep deprivation. I read it in 1986, in the weeks after the inquiry. I have read new research as it has appeared in the decades since. I understand the mechanism. I can explain it clearly to anyone who asks. Understanding the mechanism has not helped as much as I thought it would. What I think about, in February, when the light is this particular quality, and the desk lamp is the only thing illuminating the signal lens on my desk, is a much simpler thing than the mechanism. I think about the approach signal at mile 170.6. I think about what it looked like at 8:38 in the morning on February 8, 1986, from the cab of locomotive 5586, traveling west at 59 miles per hour. I think about the amber light coming through the cold air of the Alberta foothills, yellow over red. Slow down, prepare to stop. The next signal is red. I think about whether Jack Hudson saw it, not whether it was visible. It was visible. I know this. The inquiry confirmed it. I have never doubted it. I think about something different, which is harder to name, and which I have never said out loud to anyone in 39 years of thinking it. I think about what it is to see something and not register it, to look at a warning and have the looking pass through you without triggering the response the warning was designed to trigger. Whether that is a failure of the warning, or a failure of the person receiving it, or whether that distinction is even meaningful when the result is the same. I drove past Signal 1703 on the morning of February 7th. I looked at the mast from the highway, and I saw that it was there, and I did not stop. There was no reason to stop. Everything was correct. The signal was doing what it was supposed to do, and I knew this and I kept driving. I am not comparing these two things. I want to be clear about that. What I did was drive past a certified signal on a highway in daylight with no indication of any problem, and what happened in that cab was something else entirely, something that killed 23 people, and that I cannot name, and that the inquiry could not name, and that no one will ever be able to name because the naming burned. I am not comparing them. I know they are not the same. I have spent 39 years not comparing them. I have spent 39 years noting the difference, precisely and carefully, every time the comparison begins to form. There is a difference. The difference is real and significant, and I have documented it in my own mind with the thoroughness of a man who spent 31 years certifying signal systems, a man trained to be exact about what a document says and what it does not say, what a certification covers and what it leaves open. What I have not been able to document in 39 years is what I should have done differently, whether stopping would have changed anything, whether a second inspection, 12 days after the first, would have found any fault that the first inspection had missed, whether the lamp I held up at the inquiry and said this is what they saw was the same lamp that was in the housing that morning, or whether I have spent 30 years looking at a replica of the warning and calling it the thing itself is unknown. I retired 11 years ago. I still drive Highway 16 sometimes in the summer when I go west to visit my daughter in Jasper. I pass the signal location every time. The mast has been replaced since 1986. Several times, probably. The housing is newer. The lamp is newer. The aspect it displays is the same. Yellow over red. Slow down. Prepare to stop. I do not stop. There is never any reason to stop. Everything is always correct, and I know this. And I keep driving, and I watch the signal recede in the rear-view mirror until it is small enough to disappear. And I wonder, in the way I have been wondering for 39 years, whether that is what it looked like from the other direction, coming toward it instead of past it. Whether the amber light in the cold air of the foothills looked from the cab of a westbound locomotive at 59 miles per hour in the early morning of February 8, 1986, like a warning that demanded a response, or whether it looked like everything else on a familiar route at the end of a short night. A light you had seen 100 times. A light that was always there. always correct, always doing what it was supposed to do. A light you knew so well, you did not have to look at it directly to know it was there. Whether that is what seeing something without registering it feels like from the inside. Like knowing without looking. Like a warning that is so reliably present that its presence stops meaning anything. I do not know. The inquiry did not know. No one will ever know. Because the knowing is in the wreckage. And the wreckage was sold for scrap in the months after the collision. And the two men who could have answered the question are 39 years gone, and the answer went with them into whatever the fireball left behind. I have a signal lamp on my desk. It is amber. It means slowing down, preparing to stop. I look at it in the dark sometimes, and I try to see it the way they saw it, and I cannot. And I think that is the thing I have been trying to tell you all along. Not the crash, not the inquiry, not the unknown reasons, and the incapacitation and the 3.5 hours of sleep. This, that I have spent 39 years trying to see a warning the way a person sees it when the warning does not work. And I cannot do it, because I am a person for whom warnings work, and I will never know what it is to be otherwise. The trains still run through the foothills. I can hear them sometimes, at night, from the back of the house, if the wind is right. That long sound in the dark, constant and unhurried, moving through the mountains the way they have always moved. It is not a frightening sound. It is just a sound, a thing that is there, correct, present, doing what it is supposed to do. I listen to it anyway. I have driven Highway 16 West every February for 39 years, not always on the 8th. Sometimes the roads are closed on the 8th, or the weather is the kind that makes a 77-kilometer stretch of mountain highway between Hinton and Jasper into something you do not attempt alone in a bungalow-sized sedan at 5 in the morning. Sometimes I have been ill, or my daughter has been away, or there has been a reason that felt legitimate enough at the time that I accepted it and drove west a week later instead, or did not drive at all, and sat at my desk with the lamp and told myself it amounted to the same thing. It does not amount to the same thing. I have always known this. This February I left Edmonton at 4:30 in the morning. The temperature was -22. The sky was the specific black of the Alberta prairie before dawn. No gradation, no approaching light, just the flat dark pressing down, and the headlights making a tunnel of it ahead of me, and nothing on either side of the highway for the first 40 kilometers. Except the occasional glow of a farmyard, set far back from the road, someone else awake in the dark for their own reasons. I had my coffee in the cup holder. I had the heater on high. I had the radio off, which is not something I usually do on long drives, but which felt, this morning, like the correct decision. I did not want anything between me and the road. I want to tell you what I was thinking about for the first hour of that drive. Because it is not what you would expect. I was thinking about a form. A signal maintenance certification form from January of 1986. The kind that was printed on thin green paper in those years. Has 3 copies, one for the division file, one for the regional office, one for the inspector's own records. I have the inspector's copy. I have had it for 39 years, in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, behind the tax records and the vehicle maintenance logs, and the folder of warranties for appliances I no longer own. I have never thrown it away. I have also never framed it or displayed it or shown it to anyone, because it is not the kind of document that belongs in a frame, and it is not the kind of document you show people without a reason. What I was thinking, driving west in the dark at 4:30 in the morning, was this. The form is correct. Every entry on it is accurate. The lamp was functioning. The aspect was correct. The visibility distance was within specification. I signed my name at the bottom in blue ballpoint ink, and the signature is neat and unhurried. The signature of a man who had done this inspection and was certain of his findings. Every finding was right. I have read that form perhaps 200 times in 39 years. I know what it says. I know what it means. I know that its correctness is not in question, and has never been in question, not by the inquiry, not by CN's internal investigation, not by anyone who has ever looked at it. The form is not the problem. The form has never been the problem. What I was thinking in the dark at 4:30 was that I could not remember what the lamp looked like when I inspected it. I could remember the reading on the photometer. I could remember the aspect configuration. I could remember the ambient temperature that morning and the specific squeak of the housing hinge when I opened the access panel, and the way the cold air came out of the interior of the housing, colder than the outside air somehow, the cold of something sealed for a long time. I could remember all of that with the clarity of professional memory, the kind of memory that encodes procedural detail without effort, because the procedure has been run enough times that the body does the documenting. I could not remember what the light looked like, the color of it, the quality of it in the January air. Whether it was the kind of amber that stops you, or the kind of amber that you register and pass through. Whether a person who had slept 3.5 hours in an unheated crew room in Edson in the middle of a February night, and who had been on that locomotive for 38 minutes at that point. A person whose body was doing the driving because the mind had gone somewhere else or nowhere at all. Whether that person would have seen what I saw when I stood in front of that lamp with a photometer and a clipboard in the clear morning air after 8 hours of adequate sleep. I had been asking myself this question for 39 years, and I had been asking it from a desk. I had been holding up a lamp I took from a signal housing sometime in 1987, and looking at it in a room and telling myself I was asking the right question. And what I understood, somewhere between the 40-kilometer mark and the town of Edson, was that I had never once asked the question from the right place. I had never stood at that signal in February in the dark at 5 in the morning and looked at it. I pulled off the highway outside Edson and sat for a moment with the engine running. The town was dark, except for the lights of the truck stop on the service road, the orange sodium glow of it, and a single lit window in a house across the highway that I looked at for a few seconds before I understood I was looking at it because it was the only light I could find, and my eyes needed something to hold on to. I was 68 years old, and I had driven this highway more times than I could count, and I had never stopped at the signal location in 39 years, and I was 43 kilometers away from it. and I could feel in the specific way you feel a thing when you have been not doing it for long enough that I was going to stop today. I pulled back onto the highway. I drove west. The sky began to change somewhere past Hinton, the black going slightly less absolute, a quality of not quite dark. That is not yet the approach of light, but is the first suggestion that light is a thing that will eventually happen. The road was dry. There had been no new snow in several days, and the highway crews had been through, and the surface was clear, the kind of clear that looks safe until the temperature is low enough that the pavement holds a film of moisture that has not quite frozen, the kind of driving surface that requires your full attention and gets it. I drove carefully. I had the heater on high. The coffee was long gone. Mile 170.6. I knew the location before I saw the signal. I have known this location for 39 years, the way you know the location of a scar. Not because you are always thinking about it, but because the knowledge is underneath everything else. Always present. Part of the map of the world your body carries without being asked. When the signal came into view, I did not need the kilometer marker to tell me where I was. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and stopped the car. The signal was ahead of me, and to my right, the mast was than the one that stood here in 1986, and the housing had been updated twice in the intervening decades. The lamp was amber. Yellow over red, slow down, prepare to stop, the next signal is red. It was doing what it was supposed to do because there was track activity further west, and the dispatcher had set the aspects accordingly, and I was looking at it from a stationary car on the shoulder of a highway, which is not the same as looking at it from the cab of a West freight locomotive at 59 miles per hour. I knew this. I got out of the car anyway. The cold was something else outside the car. Minus 22 does not feel like a number when you are standing in it in the dark, on the shoulder of a highway in the Alberta foothills. It feels like a physical presence, the specific pressure of air that has no interest in you and will do what it does, whether you are in it or not. My breath came out in a cloud that the wind took immediately. I had my coat and my gloves and my hat, and I was still cold in the way that tells you the cold is not something you are experiencing so much as something you are inside of. I walked to the signal, not to the housing. I am not an active CN employee, and I had no business opening the access panel, and that was not what I was there for anyway. I walked to the base of the mast, and I stood there and I looked up at the lamp. Amber. Yellow over red. The color was unambiguous. In the dark of a February morning at 5:47, with no other light source within 100 meters, and the sky still not quite decided about dawn, the signal was, there is no other word for it, visible, present. The kind of light that registers before you have decided to look at it. The kind of light you see from the corner of your eye and turn toward. Unambiguous. I stood there in the minus 22, and I looked at it, and I felt something shift in my chest that I want to be precise about, because precision is the only tool I have that still feels reliable, and I want to use it correctly. It was not relief. It was something that had no clean name, something that lived in the space between the question I had been asking for 39 years, and the answer I was looking at. The signal was visible. A crew in that cab could not have missed it. And what that meant, what it had always meant, underneath all the inquiry language about incapacitation and unknown factors and probable causes, was that whatever happened inside that cab in the final minutes before impact was not about seeing or not seeing the warning. It was about something else, something the warning could not reach, something the warning was not designed for and could not have been designed for. Because warnings are designed for people who are present enough to receive them, and whatever Jack Hudson was in those final minutes, he was not present. Not in the way a warning requires. My signals worked. My signals worked completely, and they were not enough. And there is no version of signal design, no technical advancement, no photometer reading or visibility specification or amber lens of any particular candela rating that would have changed that. The gap between a correctly functioning warning and a person present enough to act on it is not a gap that engineering closes. It is a gap that lives somewhere else entirely, in the territory of exhaustion and human limitation, and the specific failure modes of a body that has been asked to do more than a body can reliably do. I had spent 39 years trying to close that gap from the wrong side. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, or not only from the cold. I pressed my right thumb against the palm of my left hand and held it there, the way you hold on to something when your hands need an instruction to follow, and I stood at the base of the signal mast in the dark and the -22, and I looked at the amber light above me, and I breathed. The lamp sat in the amber housing, clean and unambiguous. It looked exactly like the lamp on my desk. Exactly like what I had been holding up for 30 years in conference rooms and inquiry chambers and conversations with young engineers who needed to understand what the warning architecture looked like from the inside. I had been showing them the right thing. I had always been showing them the right thing. I had just never stood here to find out. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for the cold to move from the outside of my coat to somewhere inside it. Long enough for the sky to make a decision about dawn, the black going gray at the horizon line to the east, the gray, the particular flat quality of an Alberta winter morning that gives you light without warmth. Long enough for a westbound freight to pass on the track behind the signal housing, the locomotive headlight visible a full 2 minutes before the train itself reached me. And I stood and watched it come, the way a person watches something they have been waiting to see for a long time. And when the locomotive passed the signal mast, I looked at the lamp, and the lamp and the headlight were two completely different kinds of light. And there was no version of confusion possible between them, not in clear air, not at that distance, not with that lamp doing what that lamp does. I walked back to my car. I got in. I turned the heater to high and sat with my hands in front of the vent until the shaking was only from the cold and not from anything else. Then I pulled back onto the highway and drove west toward Jasper. My daughter's name is Ruth. She is 34 years old, and she lives in a house at the edge of Jasper with her husband and their 2 children in a neighborhood where the mountain is so close that in the morning the shadow of it lies across the yard until nearly 10 o'clock. And in the summer the wildflowers come right to the fence line. And in the winter, the elk walk through without apology and stand in the driveway regarding you with the specific patience of animals who have been here longer than the neighborhood. I have been coming to this house for 11 years, since Ruth and her husband bought it, and it is one of the places in my life that I love without complication, which is a shorter list than you might expect at 68. She had coffee ready when I arrived at 7:15. The children were still sleeping. Her husband was at work. She handed me the mug before I had my coat off, and she looked at me the way Ruth has always looked at me when something is different, which is to say, she looked at me with her full attention and did not immediately ask a question. We sat at the kitchen table. The mountain shadow was still on the yard. Through the window, I could see the fence line and the dark shape of the spruce trees beyond it, and the sky above them beginning to do something with the light, the gray going pale gold at the edges, the way it does in the mountains when the sun is still below the ridge, but is getting closer. I drank my coffee. It was good coffee. Ruth makes good coffee, has since she was in university and decided that this was a thing worth doing correctly, and it is one of the small, specific pleasures of these visits that the coffee is always good and always ready when I arrive. I want to tell you about the coffee because it matters in the way that small, specific pleasures always matter when you have been standing in -22 in the dark for the better part of an hour with your hands shaking. The warmth of the mug, the smell of it. Ruth's kitchen at 7:15 in the morning. The children still sleeping. The mountain shadow on the yard. I held on to that for a little while. I needed something solid, and I held on to it. Ruth said, "How was the drive?" I said, "Clear roads. Good conditions," she said. "You stopped." It was not a question. I looked at her, and she was watching me over her own mug with the careful attention of someone who has spent 34 years learning how to ask her father things he does not answer easily. I said yes. She did not ask where or why. She knows about the collision, not everything, but the broad shape of it, the way children eventually learn the broad shape of the thing their parent has been carrying. She knows I was the signal inspector on that line. She knows I go west every February. She has never asked me, in 34 years, why I make this drive on this particular date, and I have never told her. And the thing that sits between us on that subject is not a secret, exactly, but a shape that we have both agreed to leave in its place. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me for a moment longer in the way that means she knows that is not the whole answer and has decided not to press, which is an act of kindness I have been receiving from my daughter for a long time and have not always deserved. We talked about the children. We talked about her husband's work. She told me about a project she was involved in, a native plant restoration effort along one of the park corridors, and she described it with the specific enthusiasm she has always brought to things she cares about. Her hands moving, her voice lifted, and I sat at her kitchen table in the warmth, and I listened with my whole attention the way I do not always manage to do, and tried to let the morning be what it was, which was quiet and good and real. Her son came downstairs at 8:30, 7 years old, sleep-creased and serious, and he climbed onto the chair beside me and looked at my coffee mug, and then at me and said, "Did you drive here in the dark?" I said. "I did." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Was it scary?" I said, "No. I knew where I was going." He accepted this and slid off the chair and went to find his mother, and I sat with what I had just said for a moment, turning it over the way you turn over something that came out of your mouth before your mind was finished with it. I knew where I was going. 39 years of driving west on a February morning. I had always known where I was going. What I had not known until this morning was what I would find when I got there. I stayed 2 days. I slept in the room Ruth keeps for me, under a heavy quilt, with the mountain dark outside the window and the elk moving through the yard in the night, their shapes passing the glass without sound, the way large things move when they are not concerned about being heard. I slept better than I had slept in a February in many years. I do not know exactly what to make of that. I am not sure I need to. On the morning of the 10th, I drove home, east on Highway 16, the light already in the sky by the time I left Jasper, the kind of winter morning light that is thin but present. The sun below the ridge, but doing something with the cloud cover that made the whole sky a pale, even gray gold. The road was dry. The temperature had come up to -9, which in Alberta in February feels almost mild. I had my coffee in the cup holder and the radio on low, and I drove east the way I have driven this road east 100 times, knowing every kilometer of it. I knew the signal location before I reached it. I always know it. I did not slow down. There was no reason to slow down. I was driving east, not west. The signal was oriented to westbound traffic. Its aspect had nothing to say to me, but I looked at it as I passed. I always look at it when I pass. Amber in the pale morning light, visible against the gray-gold sky the way a lamp is visible when the light around it is the right quality. Amber. Yellow over red. Slow down, prepare to stop. I watched it in the rearview mirror as I drove away from it. The way I always do. The way I have done for 39 years. East and west. Watching it recede behind me until it is small enough to disappear into the distance and the dark. It was still amber when it went out of sight. It was always amber. That was always what it was. A warning, designed correctly, functioning correctly, doing exactly what a warning is supposed to do. Present and visible and sufficient for anyone in a condition to receive it. I drove east. The sky continued doing what it was doing with the light. The road was dry and clear, and I knew every kilometer of it, and I drove home. The lamp is still on my desk. I looked at it this morning when I sat down to finish writing this. The same lamp I have had for 30 years, the same amber lens. The same aspect I have explained to 100 engineers in 100 rooms. I know what it means. I have always known what it means. What I understand now, that I did not understand before I stood at that signal in the dark at 5:47 in the morning of February 8th, 2025, is that knowing what a warning means and being in a condition to act on it are not the same knowledge. They have never been the same knowledge. I built 31 years of professional certainty on the assumption that they were, and the assumption was wrong, and the assumption did not kill anyone, and it is the assumption that I will carry for whatever years I have left, because it is mine, and it belongs to me, and I do not know how to put it down. I think about Thomas Hudson in that cab. I think about what it is to know a route so well that knowing it is no longer a conscious act. The way a warning can become so familiar that its presence stops meaning anything. The way you can see something every day for 38 minutes into a shift and stop seeing it. I think about the lunchbox on the Deadman's Pedal. I think about the 3.5 hours of sleep. I think about the 19 seconds during which two trains were visible to each other and neither one slowed. I built the warnings. The warnings were right. The warnings were not enough. I am 68 years old, and I drive Highway 16 West every February, and I stop at mile 170.6, and I stand at the base of the signal mast in the dark, and I look at the amber lamp and I try to see it, the way a person sees it, when the seeing does not produce a response. I cannot do it. I have never been able to do it. I am a person for whom warnings work, and I do not know what it is to be otherwise, and that is the thing I will never be able to inspect or certify or close. The lamp is amber on my desk. It has always been amber. It will always be amber. I look at it anyway,